Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV, so come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter I.
Alright, so today we're going to discuss something a little bit different, and that would be Indigenous Archaeology. So I is for Indigenous Archaeology. Okay, so
what is indigenous?
It means originating or occurring naturally in a particular place.
Sure, but it's not as simple as it sounds. So, for example, Britain. Who are the indigenous people of Britain? If you look at ancient DNA, we know for sure that there were times where there were people here, genetically a people, who disappeared. We don't know how. There were times when a new group of people came in and merged with the old group. So who really are the indigenous people here? Well, if we look in the real world, how the word indigenous is used, it sort of means the existing people, so people who are still around today, and by people we mean culturally and genetically, who have been in a place for the longest of any existing people. So, for example, going back to Britain, I guess that would be like the Welsh and the Scottish. Sorry, England. Okay, let's move on to a short history lesson. So, as I've mentioned previously on this show, the birth of archaeology as a discipline was very much intertwined with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. During this time, people no longer felt like they automatically owed fealty to a king or queen, so they needed some larger idea to sort of tie them down to a country, the idea of a nation state. Because, quite frankly, the idea that God-given authority was good enough, that wasn't working out so well.
Your Majesty, you're next. Do you require a blindfold?
None.
Have you any last words?
None.
Test the guillotine!
Holy!
And at the same time, it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and technology and science and the idea of progress was really getting underway. It was becoming like a secular religion. You had railroads springing up all over the place, and Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in the book On the Origin of Species in 1859. So a lot of these trends were coming together. And soon we were off to the races, and a monk named Gregor Mendel got into genetics with his famous pea plant experiments in the middle of the century. But that also led to some really bad stuff like racial pseudoscience. The idea that people were different, and that had some scientific basis, and we had to prove that to show who was in the nation, who was out of the nation, who was better one versus the other. Things like phrenology or craniology to try to establish different levels of intelligence and based on the brain size and the skull shape of different people. Weird stuff. And the idea was that that archaeology could help prove and find differences in people over time, and also find that people belonged in a certain place over time. So that gave them the claim to the land, hence the nation. A group of people, all similar as established by science, had their deep roots in this place, so it belonged to them, it was their country. And that's the direction archaeology was going in. So from the 1800s until World War II...
It got weird, didn't it?
Yeah, it got weird. So, because archaeology, so much of it was bent towards the justification of the nation, and as we know, European nations were also very interested in justifying their control over other nations via imperialism and colonialization, that became a big project in archaeology too, to justify that. So we had European colonialists going all over the world, collecting people's stuff, and displaying it and erecting it in their own cities all over Europe, or selling it to those enterprising Americans. And therefore, what was left in the colonies? Well, in many places, not much, or at least not much that was shiny or made of stone. You see, the archaeologists in this time, they quite frankly, like everyone else, lived in the racist context of the time. Now, to give them a little bit of credit, a lot of them genuinely were respectful and interested in the cultures that they were encountering all over the world. But it was all through the racial lens of the time. And also some other non-racial just prejudices, like a bias towards riches and monumental architecture, for example. So for instance, in a lot of Africa, colonial archaeologists and anthropologists and ethnographers built museums that focused a lot on the origins of humanity in Africa. But they kind of left everything else out, implying that after about 100,000 years ago, there was nothing much worth studying in Africa. And in places like the US, you often had exhibitions about indigenous people in natural history museums, where many of them are today, alongside things like animals, dinosaurs, and rocks. And they also came up with crazy ideas, like the idea that the archaeological site at Great Zimbabwe was built by some Phoenicians that went from the Mediterranean all the way down to southern Africa like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, because, you know, those savage people down there couldn't have built those great stone buildings.
Are you stupid or something?
And fun fact, Zimbabwe is the only country in the world that is named after an archaeological site. And that little bird on the flag, that actually was an artifact found on site. So fast forward to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and you have the end of colonialism, decolonization, and suddenly you have the rise of mass movements advocating for the rights of indigenous people and the end of neo-colonialism, and suddenly things really start to change. And this applies both to former colonies, so whole countries, and to populations of indigenous people within countries, domestic populations. People are demanding their right to tell their own stories. So you have the rise of the repatriation movement, which was helped along the way by official acts and laws and conventions like NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by the US Congress in 1990, and the UN General Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. Beyond repatriation, this means getting indigenous and local people involved in the actual archaeology, the digging. So you have Indians digging Indian stuff, Egyptians digging Egyptian stuff, indigenous people in the United States, Native Americans digging Native American stuff. And even when you have European or foreign archaeologists who are leading a certain archaeological excavation, they'll now usually have co-leads that are local people or local people on their teams, or they'll lead the project for the first couple of seasons and then hand it over to a locally led team. So you have a lot more of the archaeology being done by people who reflect the indigenous and local populations. And finally, this also means incorporating indigenous voices and perspectives into the interpretation and the storytelling, which is, the most important part. So this is why, for example, in a lot of museums in North America, you'll see sort of two information panels or one information panel with two sides in front of something. You'll see one bit, which is sort of the dry, scientific, boring part, and then you'll see like the Native American interpretation on the other side. It's incorporating that Native American voice into the presentation of the display. So that's progress, right? Inclusion, it's all good. Yes, but it isn't totally without problems. First, it's not like all indigenous people believe and interpret things the same way. It's also often that there's not only one indigenous group, and indigenous people can play the same kind of shenanigans that anyone else can play. So for example, that site I mentioned, Great Zimbabwe, well, if you know about Zimbabwe, after the end of colonialism there, it was ruled by a brutal dictator named Robert Mugabe. So when Zimbabwe took control of the site and invested in sort of presenting it and interpreting it, Mugabe had the story of that site really favor his own group, the Shona, which is his own indigenous group. But guess what? There were other indigenous groups. But because he was the big dear leader, he made the story sort of tie his own people more to the site in the history, to the exclusion of others. Second, it's an open question just how far this should go. For example, Let's say there was some indigenous artifact that was radiocarbon dated to 600 years old. So that's a pretty rock-solid scientific technique. But let's say for said indigenous group, that artifact was part of some myth that went back 20,000 years. Do you think that in the museum they should present it equally, that it could be 600 years old or 20,000 years old, and just sort of let the viewer decide? Well, if you answered yes, just check yourself and see if you would extend that same courtesy to a more dominant narrative, like, let's say, Christianity. Now, if you've been to churches all over the world, you know a lot of them have, like, random bits of wood that they say are part of the original cross, or bits of fingernails and bones that they say are holy relics from saints. Would you be okay with those being presented in museums as the holy bones of saints, or just some random bone that was radiocarbon dated to 100 years ago, and just sort of allow them both to stand on equal footing? That's really the question. Or how about the Shroud of Turin, which is located in a cathedral in Turin in northern Italy, where they had the Olympics a couple decades ago? Now, that bears the imprint of a man, which is supposedly Christ, because it's supposedly the shroud that he was wrapped in when he died. Now, I've seen the thing a few times, and you can see the imprint of a man there. Well, that was radiocarbon dated to, I believe, 1260 to 1390, a long time after Jesus died. And yet it is the traditional Christian understanding that that is the image of Jesus in there. Well, we know scientifically that that doesn't pan out. So would you be okay with that being in a museum and being presented as, you know, it could be the image of Christ or maybe not, you decide. So it's an open question. But I think overall what we can say is indigenous archaeology is definitely a good thing, as it promotes inclusivity and gives people a say in the narrative of their own story. So it definitely does help with the pluralism of the whole discipline. All right, so that's I for indigenous archaeology.
Archaeology porn.
Okay, so for today's archaeology porn, we're going to discuss one of my favorite things. It's the largest hoard of medieval gold and silver ever found in Britain. It's called the Staffordshire Hoard, and it is smokin'. So for this story, let's start at the present and go back to the past. In 2009, your friendly neighborhood detectorists, and a lot of our stories start with them, don't they, named Terry Herbert, got permission from farmer Fred Johnson to detect in his fields near the town of Hammerwich, which is in the county of Staffordshire in the Midlands, UK. And pretty soon, he struck gold. On July 5th, 2009, he started pulling the first gold objects out of the ground. And 5 days later, he had unearthed 244 pieces already. And at that time, they knew they had something on their hands. So they contacted the local representative of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and that's exactly what you're supposed to do here in the UK, so they were playing by the book. However, now that you're attuned to archaeologists and how we think, I know what you're probably thinking, which is, but it's all about context in archaeology. They've lost the context. This is terrible. Well, you're thinking in the right direction, but in this case, not really. You see, all of these objects were pretty much loose, scattered around the plow soil. And in fact, that field had recently been plowed, so it was disturbed and it was churned up. And if we're talking about early medieval times, this field had been plowed over for more than 1,000 years since these objects were deposited. So we didn't really lose the context. It was the only real thing that's very much suspected about the context here is that the objects were in some kind of cloth bag or bags, because they did find small or even microscopic pieces of cloth on some of the objects. But other than that, there's not really much known about how they were originally deposited. Now, of course, the authorities, seeing all this gold, realized this was the real deal. They got the permission to excavate, of course, which Farmer Fred gave them, and we're off to the races. And pretty soon it became clear that there was a lot more of the stuff under the ground. And that meant this was going to be, at least some degree of a lengthy excavation. And that created a problem, because you've got all this gold just lying around in the field and lots of people involved in the dig. So they really, really had to keep it on the hush-hush, really far down on the down low.
Everybody just shut up! Shut your mouth! Shut the up, you cunt!
And shutting up with so many people involved definitely was not an easy thing to do, but they managed to basically accomplish that because nobody really found out what was going on before it was announced. Now, they were definitely not helped by the fact that the farm was right up against the A5, which is a major roadway in Britain, and it actually has been since Roman times. So this was one of the major roads that the Romans constructed through their territory, running basically from all the way in the southeast coast, I believe in Kent and through London, and all the way up northwest, up into, I guess, Wales. And that was still in use during the Anglo-Saxon times. They renamed it Watling Street. So that's the A5, which ran right by the property. And then on the other side, there was another major motorway, the M6. So there was a lot of sort of passers-by who might have been wondering why there was a giant hole being dug in the field. But as I said, they must have largely succeeded because nobody interfered with the dig. And after all was said and done, they pulled about 4,000 fragments of precious metal out of the ground, comprising about 700 individual objects. In total, it was 5.1 kilograms of gold and 1.4 kilograms of silver. Now, that's about 11 pounds of gold and 3 pounds of silver.
Holy Mary, Mother of God. Look at that.
Now, to be fair, there was a little bit of it, 91 pieces that were picked up in a subsequent excavation in 2012. But, 95% plus of it was taken up in that 2009 investigation. So what happened next? The public announcement came in September 24th, so they must have been working in the field for, a month or so. And it created a huge public sensation internationally, because after all, that was more gold and silver that was found than in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which of course is England's most famous medieval treasure ever found, and one of the featured highlights of the British Museum. So the Staffordshire Hoard outstripped that in terms of the amount of precious metals. So from there, Britain's Unique Treasure Act process takes over, and that entails the coroner, so the same dude who deals with the dead bodies in the county, declaring this to be treasure. And from there, it belongs to the crown. So like the king and queen. At that point, it was the queen. And they auction it off to the highest bidder. Now, of course, the museums and educational institutions get first dibs ahead of private buyers. But this was valued at £3.3 million. That's a heavy lift for any museum to take on. But luckily, the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery and the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery pooled their resources, raised the funds, and they bought it. And we're lucky they did, because if that was not the case, it might have gone into private hands and even been divided. And those museums are where you can see it today if you want to visit it. At the Potteries in Stoke-on-Trent, and the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in Birmingham, although the latter is closed for renovation now. There's also pieces of it on display, a few pieces in the Tamworth Castle, and also Lichfield Cathedral. Now, it's kind of a shame that it's separated up like that. I think most of it is in Stoke-on-Trent, but it's separated in 4. But the reality is they had to give dibs to the ones who could pay for it. And if they hadn't pooled their resources, it wouldn't be on display for the public. So that's just the reality. But wait, what about our friends Fred and Terry? Well, don't worry, they were well taken care of. You see, under the Treasure Act, the amount of the sale, even though it was done via the Crown, doesn't go to the Crown. It's split between the landowner and the finder. And I believe under the law, they can have some kind of prior arrangement, and if there is none, it's 50-50. So they both got, £1.65 million. Now, I'm not really sure what happened, but they actually had a very public falling out and have done a lot of talking of each other in the press. Now, they're both accusing of each other of wanting to hoard, well, the hoard. Okay, so not 100% happy for them, but I'm sure they're okay with their millions. So, beyond the drama, what is in this hoard? Well, the answer is a lot. So first, some background. Based on the style of the items, it was immediately apparent that this was early medieval from the Anglo-Saxon part of Britain. And how did they know this? So first, the pieces are largely comprised of garnets, the precious stone, which is pressed into designs made with gold wire. So it's a kind of an inlay. And that technique is called cloisonné, and it's very, very emblematic of that period of time. Also, there are animal figures incorporated all over the items, sometimes mixed with very strange human-like figures as well. And the twisting, repeating knots crawling all over everything, that is also very common in Anglo-Saxon art. And in fact, the archaeologists, even without any dating, were able to get much more specific than the general time period. You see, the Anglo-Saxons built almost exclusively in wood. So there are very, very few structures from this time period. Really, if you're digging up an Anglo-Saxon village, what you see is stains in the ground. However, what they did a lot of is burying their dead with grave goods, particularly in the earlier part of the Anglo-Saxon period. So we do have tons and tons of material that were buried with the bodies. And over time, archaeologists, really over the last 200 years, have developed very, very tight seriations of objects. So how did a particular brooch change over time, every 10 years, and then even across counties? So they had a very, very specific idea of when these goods, dated from. And it became pretty clear that the date of this deposit was from 650 to 675. So there were objects that were older than that based on the seriations and the dating. But the fact is, the stuff had to be deposited after the newest thing, the most recently created thing was made. And that date, that final date, was anywhere from 650 to 675. So the hoard was deposited sometime after that. And more clues. So among all of these 700 some objects that were found, all of them were basically related to war. Weapons, armor, stuff like that. There was literally nothing that could be female, associated with female orientation in the whole hoard, rings or jewelry or anything else. It was all war related. Another clue. Now, even stranger, all of it had actually been deliberately destroyed, wrenched apart, torn apart, ripped apart, and crushed up. Really weird. If you have this much bling, why would you ruin it? And that's a really important clue. And that's also one of the reasons why, even though it had more gold than the Sutton Hoo burial, it was much more fragmentary. So that's perhaps the reason why, to this day, Sutton Hoo is still more famous, and you see, bad Hollywood productions about it. So, folks, that's what we've got. A whole bunch of gold and silver war gear, which was ripped to shreds and just plunked in the ground. And that happened after 650 to 675. That's what we know. And what are the specific pieces worth mentioning? Well, first and foremost, there are tons and tons and tons of pieces of swords. Sword pommels, sword handles, little bits and bobs that I don't even know the name of. But guess what? No blades. There was not a single blade found. That's pretty weird, huh? But in any event, from having so much material, they learned quite a lot about it. First, the material was from all over England, and they know that because there has, as I mentioned, been so much material found in the past with burials, that there are known to be different sort of sub-regional styles. And it's believed, I think, that most of this stuff came from East Anglia and Kent, which in the early medieval times were sort of where it was at. So this stuff came from all over England, a lot from East Anglia and Kent. Second, with just so much material, they did learn a bit more about how these weapons and other objects were manufactured, how they were put together. You have to remember, they didn't have modern tools and microscopes. It's incredible, the tiny scale of the workmanship. And through some of the repairs and other pieces that may have been damaged, they got to see how these things were put together. And thirdly, this is really cool, like in other finds of this nature, although not ever this big before, a lot of these materials seem to have been in use long before they were put into the ground. So you see that in Anglo-Saxon tombs where people are buried with weapons and brooches. Those are much older than the burial. So what that means, combined with the fact that each piece was sort of individually designed and uniquely created with its own look, and they were all different, that combined with the fact that they were, many of them, old when they went in the ground, strongly suggests that these were heirlooms. They were made for a specific person or clan or family, and they were kept as some kind of an identifier or just that person's unique, piece. And there has been some thought that there was a belief that swords especially had kind of spirits, and the fact that they were held on to and so unique, that sort of plays into that storyline. So that was basically the bulk of the Hoard, all this stuff about swords and weapons. But the showstopper was the Staffordshire Hoard helmet, which rivaled the Sutton Hoo helmet in terms of sheer badassery. Now, what you're seeing on that grizzled old warrior is a reconstruction, of course, not the original. But the specialists in this case are able to infer crazy amounts of stuff from just fragmentary pieces. However, to be fair, this did involve quite a bit of imagination, just like the reconstruction of the Sutton Hoo helmet. You see, the helmet, like the other weapons, was found in pieces, and it had to be put back together. But what's so cool is there have only been fragments from a few helmets in the entire early Anglo-Saxon period. And the reason for that was at this time, a helmet was a signifier of a king or a very high status person, not a crown. The crown was adopted later. So it's very likely that this helmet was sort of like the crown belonging to one of the kings of the 7 kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy.
If we choose you, will you wear the crown? Will you lead the 7 kingdoms to the best of your abilities?
And another oddity, there's almost nothing that bears any inscription or writing that gives us a clue as to what all this business is about, except one gold strip that does have a short inscription on it, which is the Latin translation of a portion of Psalm 67. And this says, "Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered. Let those that hate thee flee before thee." So yeah, that's a pretty good hint this had something to do with war and fighting. In fact, it's a pretty good guess that this strip may have been attached to like a weapon or a belt as a kind of good luck charm for the battle. And this verse was not rare in Anglo-Saxon England. It's found elsewhere, and one of the things it's associated with is Saint Guthlic, who was a saint associated with Mercia, perhaps the royal dynasty of Mercia, which is the kingdom where the hoard was found. So that's a good connection there. And finally, there's a few crosses, but 2 in particular I want to focus on. There's one that's understood to be a pectoral cross, so something worn. And that honestly is almost totally complete. It's just a bit bent, one of the arms. So that's a really in good shape. And there's another one, which is also among the more complete pieces in the whole hoard, which is in its entirety, but it's all folded up and folded in on itself. And it seems to be missing its precious stones, which probably would have been garnets. Now that's interpreted as a processional cross or an altar cross. So something that may have been put on an altar or something that may have been sort of carried around in a parade. And very well, both of those would have made it into battle, because we know from written accounts at this time that priests and monks and bishops went into battle to pray for their side. But even more, we know full well that at this time, those same holy men, they often fought and led armies themselves. We knew there were bishops that were going around marauding, burning, pillaging. So yeah, at that time, the church and warfare were not mutually exclusive. So that was just a quick tour, but you get the idea. There was so much that it was absolutely overwhelming. So after it was discovered in 2009, the hoard was cleaned up, and then it went on some temporary displays. It even took a little trip to the United States where it was displayed there. And what was really cool at that time was they left on purpose some of the mud from it, so you could really see how it looked when it came out of the ground. But this period of study did last from 2009 to 2019, so 10 years, and it was continued to be studied even after the permanent exhibition opened up in 2014. So I guess maybe they were rotating the materials or studying them part-time. And obviously they learned a lot of really cool stuff with all the sciencing they were doing. One of the things, of course, was they found those smaller microscopic bits of cloth, which suggested it was in a bag. They also were able to chemically analyze some of the resins and adhesives that were used to hold the gemstones, the garnets, in place. So those were some cool learnings. Now, another one I'd like to mention is what's called peaks analysis, or particle-induced X-ray emission analysis. And what that did was it was able to analyze the garnets and essentially match them to the profiles of garnets elsewhere and say where they came from. So I believe some of them came from Southeastern Europe, like Hungary, but others came as far away as India, Sri Lanka, or maybe Southeast Asia. So that shows that, yeah, England might have been a backwater at that time, but it was a backwater that was connected with long and global trade routes that stretched even beyond the known world at that time. So now for the fun part, whodunit? What the was all this gold and treasure doing out in the middle of a field that was far away from major settlements even at the time that it was deposited? So let's look at our clues. It was found in Mercia. The treasure was deposited anywhere from 650 to the 680s or 90s. It was full of riches, but those were really callously destroyed, sort of wantonly ripped apart, and in a way really disrespected. And among those things was the remains of a helmet, which would have been tantamount to a crown at this time. So putting it together, what does that all mean? Well, one clue comes from a text. It comes from Beowulf, which you may have read when you were in high school, perhaps. Now, that's an epic tale, and why it's so important historically is, remember, these are the Dark Ages, so there's very little writing from that time that survived. So a lot of the clues as to what warrior culture was like in those days, they come from Beowulf. So now let me read one specific passage of Beowulf, and I'm going to have to read it because it's too long. One warrior stripped the other, looted Oguntheow's iron mailcoat, his hard sword hilt, his helmet too, and carried Graith to King Hygelac. He accepted the prize, promised fairly that reward would come, and kept his word. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone to earth, as useless to men now as it ever was. So this passage describes warriors stripping off the pommels and ripping apart the, gear, the kit of their defeated enemies. So that very well might be what happened here, because just like in the book, it was deposited in the earth, useless to men as it ever was. So who could have done this and why here? Well, even though it was the Styx in the 7th century, the deposition spot was right next to Watling Street, which was still used as a major thoroughfare during these times, going right through the kingdom of Mercia from southeast to northwest. Also, even though it wasn't very close to any major settlements, it was in between some of them. So not too far away was Lichfield, where a major cathedral of the kingdom would later be built. Also Tamworth, which would later become sort of the capital of Mercia. And capital should go in air quotes, because at this time, the way the royal court and the king worked is they kind of traveled around the whole kingdom constantly and sort of ate and feasted at different places and just kind of reminded people who was boss and made judgments. So that's how they rolled. But Tamworth would go on to become the closest thing that Mercia would ever have to a capital. And who would have been doing a lot of fighting at this time to having collected all of these weapons? Well, I like to think first of King Penda. He was the last great pagan king in Anglo-Saxon England. So yeah, he would not have had a lot of respect for those crosses that were all crumpled up. Now, Penda was an all-around badass who basically completely dominated his era. In fact, so much so that after he was known as one of the Bretwaldas, I forget how many of those there were over the course of Anglo-Saxon history, maybe 6, 7, I can't quite remember. But Bretwalda was basically an overlord king who dominated all the others. So only technically king of his own kingdom, and there were 7 of them, but he became sort of the hegemon, we can say. It's important to remember, however, that that term was not used at this time. It was used retrospectively. But in any event, Penda was pretty much a boss. In fact, he killed at least 3 other Anglo-Saxon kings, maybe even 5. So yeah, he did dominate. Well, fate eventually caught up with Penda. Now, we're only getting this from one source, which was the Venerable Bede. And he was a monk who was living a pretty isolated existence in Jarrow, which was in the kingdom of Northumbria. And remember those monks, they were very interested in geese and eclipses and the dates of Easter, not so much in warfare and women and, the other stuff we'd want to know about. So Bede wasn't too interested in the details of the fighting, but this is what he does tell us. That King Penda went to Northumbria to fight and give the smackdown to Oswiu, who was the king there. And he cornered Oswiu in a fort somewhere. He does name the place, I just can't remember offhand. And he forced Oswiu to pay him a tribute, and then he got up to leave. Because that's what a lot of warfare was about at this time, just getting someone to sort of say uncle and pay you off. Now, in the night, it seems that some of Penda's troops, forces under his command, deserted him or left. It's not clear exactly, but they left. Not totally surprising, because a lot of the forces fighting under his banner were not him. Remember, he was a boss, so he got a lot of people to fight for him who he had defeated or cowered into doing that, so they didn't necessarily like him. And it seems that after he was sort of headed back to Mercia, he was either ambushed or attacked by Oswiu at a weak point. So even though Penda had won the engagement, Oswiu wound up cornering him and defeating him and killing him eventually. So that was the end of Penda. Now, what could have happened here? So that all went down at a place called the Whinawade. So it was called the Battle of the Whinawade, where Penda was eventually killed. And we don't actually know where that is. But one thing that very well could have happened is Penda collected all this war booty, buried it as per Beowulf, and then was going back to Mercia, and that's when he was killed at the Battle of the Whinawade. Or it could have been that he was killed at the Battle of the Whinawade and had all this stuff that he was actually bringing back with him to Mercia. And then one of the people who escaped, because a few did, not all of them were killed, then took this stuff and buried it, intending to come back and collect it, but never got the chance. So those are some pretty good explanations to all of these, putting all these facts together as to what would have happened. But honestly, we will very likely never know. But Penda would be a good guess because of all the fighting he did. And it is within our time period. The Battle of the Whinawade was recorded by Bede as 655, which is at the earlier part of our 650 to 680, 90 kind of time frame, but definitely still possible. And even if it wasn't to do specifically with Penda, it very likely could have involved him because, remember, he was the overlord king guy. So after he was killed, there was obviously a lot of instability in Mercia and between the different kingdoms. In fact, Oswiu, shortly after Penda's death, came to dominate Mercia. One of Penda's sons took power as the king, but he only lasted a year or something, and then another son came. So it was a time of great instability and a lot of fighting, so this could have had to do with that period of time. But once again, we'll probably never know. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, you could come by and see this bling in person, at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent or at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in Birmingham. However, as of this recording, that latter one is closed. So if you're going to see it soon, it will have to be in Stoke-on-Trent. Now, the exhibition is free, but be a good sport and leave them a donation. As you'll see, the museum is clearly lacking for funding and overall is pretty lackluster. However, the amazing pieces of the hoard, the absolute bling, will take your breath away. But don't fog up all that glass as you're leering at this smoking archaeology porn, because you'll find yourself just staring at it. There is a general lack of depth in the captions. It's not like there's nothing written, it's just rather shallow. But this video, plus other things you can read up on, will probably tell you all you really want to know about the hoard. But if you want to read and see more, there is an absolutely beautiful book on the collection, which has, just delicious photography where you can really get a close-up view of the archaeology porn. So remember, the next time you're in England, you will definitely want to make it to Stoke-on-Trent because you won't want to miss this.
Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
Alright, so for today's edition of Archaeology News, we have a pretty diverse lineup of stories, which will take us to Panama, Germany, and Indonesia. So let's start off with Panama, where the weather is warm and the canals are long. And we're going to go right off to El Caño Archaeological Park, right in the middle of this snake-like isthmus of a country. Now here, the uncovering of a high-status tomb full of gold was just announced. Now, to be honest, this was not a shocker. This is, after all, an archaeological park, because prior to this, there were 8 other tombs excavated, all high status. So it was known that there would be a tomb here. So what's the big deal? Why is this a story? First of all, the sheer amount of bling that was found.
All day my phone ringing, bling, bling, bling. Cause in my earrings from a mile, bling, bling.
Among the finds, and these are coming to you courtesy of the Panamanian Ministry of Culture, I'll put the link in the show notes, we have found 5 pectorals, essentially breastplate jewelry that was used for the deceased. And I'll give you a sec to take in the photos. 2 belts made of gold beads, several gold bracelets and necklaces, 2 gold earrings in the form of human figures, a few pieces of jewelry made from the teeth of animals, including 2 earrings made from the teeth of a sperm whale, and a few other assorted golden figurines. Now, if these photos look doctored to you, like they couldn't look like that just coming out of the ground, remember that gold, unlike most other metals and certainly, complicated alloys, does not tarnish. So if you find a piece of gold in the ground, it's going to look a lot like it did when it went into the ground, assuming no heat or chemical processes were undertaken on it. So gold, it just looks magic when you pull it out of the earth. Now, secondly, the grave goods in this tomb were different from the others. You see, the other 8 tombs that they excavated before this one, they were full of weapons, and the pendants that they had in jewelry was made from the teeth of predatory animals. So those were obviously interpreted as that they were commemorating sort of warlike warlord guys, right? Because of all this martial and aggressive imagery. And in that day, so long ago, probably warlords and political leaders were basically the same thing. That seems pretty consistent all over the place. However, this tomb was not buried with any weapons. In fact, the artifacts that were found, other than all of that bling, were some flutes made out of animal bones. And it was thought that these flutes played an important role in religious ceremonies, maybe communicating with the spirits or somehow connecting the player and the listeners to the animal world from whence the flutes came. And for this reason, the deceased in this tomb was interpreted to be some kind of priest, and they also dubbed him, because of these artifacts, the Lord of the Flutes. How original. Finally, the Lord of the Flutes was buried face down, directly on top of the body of a woman. And what his relationship was with this woman, we don't know. And unfortunately, even with DNA, we're unlikely to find out. Why is that? Well, these tombs are about 1,200 years old. That probably seems like nothing considering, they're extracting DNA that's tens of thousands of years old. But the trouble is, Panama, as I mentioned before, is in a balmy climate that's also very humid and gets a lot of rain. And although techniques are improving, it's difficult to extract DNA in those kinds of climates because DNA doesn't hold up very well there. So in the previous excavations, when they tried to test the other remains for DNA, they didn't come up with anything significant. So unfortunately, even though these are just 1,200 years old, it's unlikely that DNA will be able to shed any light on the relationships between these folks anytime soon. However, the tomb hasn't been finished excavated yet. And from the looks of the pictures, there's a lot going on down there. And one of the things they're likely to find is a whole bunch of other people. You see, when those other tombs were excavated, they actually found lots of other people along with the main body. In fact, between 8 and 32 people per tomb. So that's quite a party they have going on down there. And who were those people? Probably retainers, slaves, servants, other people who would be important in the afterlife. And I know that sounds pretty gross, sacrificing people who serve loyally just when the master dies. However, that's something that you see actually a lot in the world, from Egypt to a lot of parts of Europe in ancient tombs. And maybe one show I will tell you about a live account, an eyewitness account of a Viking funeral. But maybe not. This is actually a family-friendly show. But let's just say, yes, it's a morbid practice, but you see that in other places. Anyway, watch this space. They still haven't finished digging, and from the looks of the photo, that tomb is chock full of other stuff. Okay, now we're off to Germany, where another tomb, this one much older, was discovered. But the difference is this one was discovered by accident. So, let's go to the city of Magdeburg, which is about 150 kilometers or 100 miles west of Berlin, the capital. And there, Intel, the American chipmaker, was building a big facility. So in order to do the construction, they needed to have an archaeological survey. Let's pause for a moment. If you remember from my interview with Mike Parker Pearson, most archaeology is actually done by what's called rescue or commercial archaeology. And he had a big role in developing the protocols for that in the UK. So what that is when you have a building, something that needs to be built, there are legally required steps you need, like an environmental survey. One of those is an archaeological survey. Now, big projects like factories or airports or highways or railways, those are often jackpots for archaeology. Some examples in this country, the UK, in recent times are the extension of Heathrow runway and Terminal 5 at Heathrow. There's HS2, this big high-speed rail disaster happening right now. They find lots of stuff in those projects. Now, unlike what you're thinking, once again, that's actually how most archaeology is done. It's not done by mustachioed old archaeology professors, deciding they want to study a place. It's done to rescue the archaeology before it's destroyed. At least things are noted. So that's what happened here in Germany. And what did they find? Some pretty weird stuff. They found 2 giant burial mounds, 20 to 30 meters long. That's like 65 to 100 feet. And those contained several burials. And what was cool is, in addition to those burials, they were also made of wood. So essentially, they were some wooden structures that were then covered in earth. And that allowed them, of course, to radiocarbon date these things, the bodies and the structures. And let me tell you, these things are old. 6,000 years old to be exact. Now, they belong to what's called the Baalberg culture, which is an archaeological culture in this area of Germany that lasted from about 4000 to 3100 BC. Now, it's very important here to point out that in archaeology, when we say a culture, an archaeological culture, we're referring simply to the material remains, a style of the material remains, which is usually ceramics or pottery, which it is in this case. Now, the mistake people often make is equating that with a culture of people, and that is a big problem. Why is that a problem? Well, it really messes up our interpretation of what might have happened. For example, and I think I mentioned this one before in a different episode, the Soviet Union, as we know, collapsed in the early 1990s. And suddenly that they were open to the world, and you had this big proliferation of American fashion, blue jeans and big hair. Now, let's pretend we're an archaeologist 10,000 years in the future studying the material remains of that time. If we sort of equated the material culture with an actual human culture or polity, we could very easily conclude that America invaded this whole area of the world, and so all of this material culture was Americans either enforcing it on the people there, or the people adopting it because America was victorious, or America actually just sort of colonized that area. And as we know, that's not what happened. But if we assumed material culture spoke for a human culture, we would make that mistake. Another acid test I use, just imagine our life, wherever you are right now. You died and got buried, and someone was studying you long in the distant future. Well, thanks to our phones, they might assume that some Apple country, the Apple culture, let's call it, took over almost the whole world in a mighty empire. I have a Samsung, but you get the point. That's not what happened. And yet, if we equate an archaeological culture with a human culture, that's what we would believe. So that's just a quick way to think about how simplistic archaeological interpretations can be and how that goes wrong. But anyway, I digress. Let's get back to the subject. So there were these Neolithic people 5,000 or 6,000 years ago who left behind the ball-beared culture. And as happens in many places, a lot of the remains, these monuments that they built, like these burial mounds, were repurposed later by other people. And you see this all over the place. If you look at Stonehenge, for example, that was built at some point and it was in use for hundreds and even thousands of years after that. And the whole landscape around it as well, if you remember from my conversation with Mike Parker Pearson. And as time passed, different people came and went, and they added to it, they changed it, as they were incorporating it into their own sort of belief system and ritual practices. And this probably had an important role in legitimating their ties to the land, because they took these, what they even recognized then to be old ancient structures, and brought them into their mythologies, tying them to the land in a sense, legitimating their reason for being there. You see this in my area of study too, where early medieval people in Britain, they actually buried their dead sometimes in Iron Age and even older features like burial mounds. And as we know, these early medieval people in Britain, a lot of them were immigrants. They were new to the area. So this act of sort of putting their dead in with the ancient ancestors and recognizable features in the land, that was probably pretty important to them to try to, stick their mythology in there and tie themselves to the land. Even though they were newcomers, they belonged there. Anyway, so like 1,000 years after those two mounds were built, there was another group of people who had an archaeological culture that we call the globular amphora culture, once again named after their ceramics. So they set up shop in the area. And they actually built a processional route between those two mounds. So they incorporated this now into their own space. And they buried a man along that route. He was 35 to 40 years old, probably a ripe old age at that time. But here's where it gets a little weird. Then they also sacrificed two 2 to 3 year old cattle, and they buried those behind the man. And next to the man, they buried a chariot. So essentially with these burials, what they were doing was simulating this sort of image of a man in a cart being pulled by oxen, maybe plowing the land, and being pulled on to the great unknown, let's say. And you actually see this kind of thing in burials around this area at this time, this same sort of manipulation of an image. And it also probably shows the importance of cows, cattle in their culture, because those feature very prominently as well. And we see this in other places, other parts of Europe and the Middle East. At this time, cows and cattle, these were probably among people's most prized possessions. Their food source, their heat source, their fertilizer source, their transportation. So that's what you're seeing in these burials. And then, about 1,000 years after that, the corded ware people came to town. Now, they were people from the Eurasian steppe who came to populate much of Europe at that time in the early Bronze Age. And they actually dug a ditch along the processional routeway, and they didn't actually disturb the other features, and they incorporated it into a landscape of their own. Because just about half a kilometer, a little more than that, away from the mounds, they built some burial mounds of their own and buried their dead there. So here you have it, 3 different groups of people, 1,000 years spaced apart, starting 6,000 years ago, all elaborated upon this same landscape with burials and other features that were significant to them. And again, that's something you see in a lot of places. If you want to know more about that at Stonehenge, watch my interview with Mike Barker-Pearson. All right, and finally off to Indonesia for a bit of fake news. So you may remember this late last year in 2023 because it actually broke out into the popular media, where there was supposedly something like a 25,000-year-old man-made pyramid discovered in Gunung Padang, Indonesia, sort of in between Jakarta, the capital, and another main city, Bandung. Now, when I first heard about this, it seemed pretty unbelievable to me. You see, that kind of age would put it at more than 20,000 years older than the pyramids at Giza. And to build something like that, you need to marshal so many human resources, which usually requires some kind of system of authority or statehood. And there just, as far as I know, wasn't any evidence for that in what is now Indonesia, or really anywhere else in the world that long ago. So you need some material remains to really be convincing that that was man-made that long ago. Secondly, this reminded me of a sort of man-made pyramid hoax mountain thing from Bosnia, which was floating around about 20 years ago. Now, at that time, a wealthy businessman was shopping around this theory that this mountain outside of Sarajevo, which also looked very angular and, symmetric, was a man-made pyramid, not a natural mountain. And that panned out not so well. In fact, just a couple years ago, for and giggles, I did visit the place, and yeah, it's a natural mountain. Well, anyway, yeah, this hill in Indonesia looked a lot like that to me too from the pictures. And having been to this area in Indonesia many times, I can tell you that there's a lot of sort of pointy hills and mountains around, because this area, this Java, which is the most populated island in Indonesia, is basically one big field of dormant and even active volcanoes. I mean, they don't call it the Ring of Fire for nothing.
And it burns, 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 the ring of fire, the ring of fire.
And guess what? There is a volcano underneath this site. Well, anyway, there had been talk about this for years, so what put it in the news just recently? Well, at the end of last year, late 2023, Archaeological Prospection, an academic journal, published an article that had a few findings. So first, they did a geophysical survey of the feature and found that there were hidden chambers in the feature. Now, if you want to know more about geophysics, check out my episode a couple weeks back of the ABCs of Archaeology, where we did G for geophysics. So they did a geophysical survey. And they also took some radiocarbon dating from soil in and around the feature, and they found dates thousands and thousands of years old. So yeah, science. Pretty convincing, right?
Wrong!
Well, it also sounds too good to be true, and it was. You see, the information that they were providing in the article was totally legit, real, but their interpretation, That was BS. So the first major problem with the article was those radiocarbon dates were taken and they were legit, but they were not in areas that showed any sort of man-made features or artifacts. So they were just saying like, yeah, this is old dirt. Secondly, I hadn't heard anything more in terms of analyzing the geophysical surveys, but as you know from my ABCs of archaeology for geophysics, those are not that straightforward to interpret. So, it depends on what's in the soil. It depends what kind of technique you use, and is that right for the topography and the soil, etc. And these guys, having made that mistake, that bonehead error with the soil, I'm not sure I trust their judgment in assessing the geophysical survey. So this paper, retracted. That's right, archaeological prospection pulled it back. So as you see, the truth eventually does come out. All right, there you have it, the latest edition of Archaeology News. And remember, crime doesn't pay. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.